Hey, Hattie, it's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So there's many things we can talk about. You've had a great career, but I want to start with it's the 100th anniversary of the Harvard Business Review. How has the mission of the Harvard Business Review changed since its founding?
Well, the mission was very clear at the time of the founding. So this is 1922, 100
Yes.
years ago. Business was starting to take off in a more industrial, more organized way. And the guy who was the dean of the Harvard Business School at that time, Wallace Donham, created this magazine, and he really thought that there needed to be a theory of business.
Yes.
That business, it was haphazard and just going all over the place. And he even used the term in our original issue where he said, without it, for most people, business would be a pathetic gamble. Okay, so he really believed you had to come up with the theories. So it was very, very idealistic. How has it changed? In some ways, not at all. We still believe that research-based ideas,
Yes.
tested by research or tested in the workplace, can be hugely valuable in helping us run institutions more effectively. So in some ways, the mission is the same, although the world of business has changed since then. The ideas that we publish, everything has changed, but at the core is still that belief that by paying attention to what you do, you can run businesses, you can run institutions more effectively.
So the core of the mission hasn't changed. It's just the way you go about fulfilling it.
Well, yes. I mean, so once upon a time, the only thing we produced that people knew about were long form, 12-page
Yes.
articles. Everything was practically an academic piece. Now, those pieces are still in some ways the most important things we do. They're the ones that appear in print. We still have print, and they hopefully will define or redefine a certain area, whether it's strategy or marketing or thinking about DEI or thinking about sustainability. Will provide insight that will last for some time. But now we do so much else. I mean, we're primarily a digital publisher. We're,
Yes.
like everyone else, we're across all the platforms, and redefining value is not necessarily long. Little short spurts. We're on TikTok. The graphics. That there are various ways to convey information that will be valuable for people at work. So that's part of what's changed. Is just how is the expectations of an audience and our attempts to meet that.
Yeah, I mean, while a lot has been said about the Harvard Business Review, not much has been said or credit given to the digital transformation you've made. Because I do remember the time when most of the pieces were long form, and now it's definitely more accessible than it was maybe even 15 years ago.
I hope that's true. I mean, look, the challenge is we have a great core of fans. We have a really
Yes.
devoted audience, and it's thrilling. But then there are lots of people out there who just have no connection to the brand, and would imagine that we're overly academic or too hard or too boring or something like that. And we're writing about how people interact. We're writing about how businesses operate, and that once you put it in those terms, that touches almost everybody in the world. So um, the goal is to make it more accessible, to get HBR content in front of people where they say, "Oh, this is my life you're talking about." So that's a constant challenge, and you want to do that without blowing the brand, without dumbing it down. But so that's been what we've worked at for the last 10 years, and I think so far so good.
Well, between I think it was 1994 and 1997, all I ever read was The Economist and Time magazine. Did you know that? I mean, that's a scary statistic. It's the only two publications I read for 4 years. So coming in from Time magazine, so you were one of the senior editors, I think second most senior editor at Time magazine, and you moved into HBR. What was the transition like? What was the imprint or the style you brought into the HBR?
I think I was an unusual choice in some ways, but the CEO at that time, David Wan, he sort of got that for HBR to succeed, he needed an editor, an editing team that was more consumer focused, that was more
Yeah.
reader focused, and not author focused, and not, academia
Yes.
focused. So so once, if he's thinking that way, then somebody with my background, somebody with my experience in metabolism can help. Again, you don't want to blow the franchise and you don't want to
Yes.
turn HBR into Time Magazine. I mean, I remember some of my first meetings with the staff just saying, "Hey, we can be faster. Time Magazine, we used to create the entire magazine in a week." And I'd be very excited. And I would look at the faces
Yeah.
around the room and they were not impressed. They're like, "Yeah." And at the
You
end of the
just
day, you
scared
get,
them in that first meeting.
yeah, at the end of the day, you got Time Magazine, which was not a compliment from them. So it was really a matter of, all right, so how do you change the metabolism, but still protect what is unique and special about this publication? What do I miss? I miss, look, at time you'd sit down, there'd be the morning meeting and you would talk about what's happening in Chinese politics and the new show on Broadway and, how are the Yankees doing? And, so this
Yeah.
broad sort of global thing. HBR obviously is far narrower, it's a sort of niche thing, but I mean, the history of magazines has shown you probably want a niche. I mean, that's it, it's, unless you're the New York Times and a couple others, it's tough
Yeah.
to be big and broad and comprehensive and be successful. Better to be a little smaller, but have this devoted audience that loves what you do.
Yes, and I think you guys have done a very good job because at one point I canceled my subscription to the Harvard Business Review, and then I came back when I saw some of the changes being made.
Oh
I,
yeah, we
partic-
saw that. We saw what you were doing.
I particularly liked the theme of the big idea that resonated with me because he had a theme and they had varying viewpoints built around that, which I hadn't seen much of. So clearly, you guys are doing many good things if you're bringing back some of the old audience members. So switching gears a little bit, when you were at the Wall Street Journal, you served as Beijing bureau chief and then Moscow bureau chief. Given the fact that Russia and China is in the news pretty much all the time, do you feel that perspective has helped you in terms of positioning the HBR and so on? Has it given you any advantage?
Well, it was very sad that when Russia invaded Ukraine, I mean, first of all, that was
Yes.
catastrophically sad. Um, we had a partner, we had a Russian language edition and a partner who we liked a lot and a whole team that we really liked, and they were not in any way part of Putin's machine, and in fact,
Yes.
they really represented the opposite values. But it just became impossible. The logic of sanctions is blunt, and it's just not possible to say, well, we're going to keep this line of business going because we're doing
Yes.
business with good guys, because it's just not possible. And I was sad about that. So I mean, I think an understanding of how the world works informed that decision. It was a difficult decision. So we don't have a Russian language edition, at least currently. At the very least, it's being frozen. In China, I mean, it's this is a tough time in
Yes.
U.S. Chinese relations. I was in China in the 80s. I was there during Tiananmen. I really saw what you know a, a government can do that is horrible, and deplorable and sick. Um, that said, China is not just its government, is not just
Yes.
its politics, and
Oh,
there are
well
a lot
said.
of wonderful people in China, brilliant business minds. Um, so I'm one of those people who thinks it's important to keep, that smart people in the US and China are engaging in whatever areas they can. Look, there'll be a period where, Xi Jinping won't be around, there'll be different imperatives. Our system will evolve, our US administrations will evolve. So, there'll be opportunities. I really believe in keeping the connection. So we have a Chinese edition, and
Yeah.
we want to expand in China, and we want to connect, and we want to write about, you know, brilliant business people in China who might have lessons for the rest of the world. So maybe my take is just that, it's a long process. Things can change, and let's just keep connected in some way.
So you encourage engagement, distinguish between the people and the government, and understand that things are evolving and we shouldn't make rash judgment calls. Is that a
Yeah,
good way of
and maybe
summarizing that?
that's overly optimistic. Maybe you can say that, and then there's a point where, like with Russia, you can't continue. But I
Yeah.
guess I'm more optimistic that there is important common ground, even if it's on issues like, sustainability or something like
Yes.
that, or just pure business where the two sides can keep open channels even when the political channels are not friendly.
So switching gears here, you've seen obviously many articles that have come up. What takes an idea? I remember when Michael Porter published his piece on competitive advantage and competitive strategy. That took on a life of its own. What makes an idea enduring, in your opinion?
Yeah, we've thought a lot about this as part of this anniversary. We put together a book, HBR at 100, that where we pulled out what we thought were the most influential articles from our first century. And it's hard to boil that down and say, well, it's ideas that are relatively simple or
Yes.
ideas that, you know, um, but you're right. Porter's five forces, it's not the only way strategy is taught, and there's some
Yeah.
who think there's some flaws in the argument, but it basically is the bedrock of strategic thinking and strategic teaching, many, many, many decades later. I think in that case, it was just a framework that was new and was valuable. I mean, if you look at early HBR 100 years ago, we weren't writing about strategy.
Yeah, I
You
remember
know,
that.
the strategy, well, I'm talking about 100 years ago, and but yeah, but even later, I mean, that strategy sort of had its moment,
Mhm.
maybe somewhere midway through our life when suddenly that was a discipline that, needed the sort of business theory I was talking about, and Porter just delivered what was missing, which was kind of the great framework that could be adopted. So sometimes it's just answering a need, even if it's not clear that the
Yeah.
need is there, but you just sort of discern it. Um, but one of the most interesting things, I mean, we could get off on a long tangent about this, but the article that we published by Michael Jensen,
Yes.
Eclipse of the Public Corporation, in 1989, and Jensen and others had already written about the same idea, which was shareholder primacy. That the interests of
Yeah.
shareholders were that managers couldn't worry about everything, so worry about this, maximize shareholder value, and that will sort of take care of everything else. So that's an idea that was relatively simple. The articles weren't simple, and the theory, the agency theory that was behind it is not simple, but in a sense, it was a relatively clean approach that if managers are focused on that, it aligns them with ownership, and if you reward them with stock and stock options, that there's just this alignment with the owners, the shareholders, the managers. And there was nothing absolute about this, but it just fed into the Reagan era and
Yeah.
Milton Friedman, and
It's right for
and
its time.
it was right for its time, and it had the simplicity. And by after decades, I think CEOs thought they were legally required, or their fiduciary duty required them to maximize shareholder value, and they interpreted that as maximizing short-term shareholder value. The law says nothing of the kind. I
Mhm.
mean, yes, that responsibility to shareholders, but it doesn't mean every quarter right on the dot. But that became kind of a fad, a trend
Yeah.
that took root for 50 years. And I think we're reinventing where we're going right now, but talk about the power of an idea.
Yeah, that's just it. An idea can be right for its time, but it's used beyond its time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't know. And honestly, we're sort of, so you can say, okay, well, now you want stakeholder value. Well, that's
Mhm.
great. And think about all your stakeholders. But what does that mean? And can there be a theory that sort of brings that together other than just, well, I think a little of this, a little of that? I don't know if there can be. It hasn't been created, it hasn't been written, but I know some of our authors are trying to figure out, how do you create a piece that's as influential as the Jensen piece for the next several decades, that's about stakeholder capitalism.
So I was reading in that Wall Street Journal this morning that Larry Fink is being called on to resign. So with all the talk around ESG, do you think there's a backlash towards the ESG movement or the way it's being executed?
So ESG as a term probably has to disappear because it is a lightning rod. I mean, there are people who think it's quote unquote woke to even think about ESG, and Fink and others get criticism for that they're somehow sacrificing returns and
Yeah.
capitalism to worry about this. But then on the other side, people who are more in the kind of activist sustainability camp, who think ESG is baloney. It's not really measuring
Yeah.
whether a company is sustainable. So it's a term that nobody likes, or nobody
Yeah.
nobody
That's
trusts.
true.
So That said, so yes, Larry Fink has he has an activist shareholder now, he can't win. He's been trying to walk this fine line, and it's just difficult. And no, nobody quite respects what he's doing, which might mean he's doing a great job because everybody's mad at him. I mean, he controls more assets than anybody else, and he's tried to move the needle, at least in the conversation, toward long-termism, toward sustainability. It's been an interesting thing, and a lot of people have rewarded him for doing that, while at the same time in criticizing him for talking about it more than actually doing anything about it, because his portfolio of companies is still spread evenly among, everybody. So it's not, there aren't really he's not really pulling out of these investments that he's saying he doesn't
Yes.
respect. So I don't know. I do think the movement is real, though. I mean, I do think I don't think I don't think we're just going to return to shareholder value and stop caring about this stuff. And I think partly it's generational, and partly it's I don't know. It's a real change that even people at the top, even people who are relative, who are sort of my age, get that the world deserves better than just a hyper focus on shareholder return, and that a hyper focus on shareholder return will not take care of society's problems, which I think some people thought was implicit in that deal. But ESG as a term, yeah, we need to do better than that. I mean, the problem is you can't measure. It's easy to measure share price. It's
Yeah.
easy to measure total shareholder return. It's not easy to measure how a company contributes to pollution, what its externalities are in terms of the the problems and the
Yes.
benefits that it creates for society. So without an easy measurement, it's hard to quantify and understand in the same way you can share price. I guess I have hope and faith that we're getting better at measuring these things, and that's part of how this movement will strengthen rather than weaken.
Well, I think the good news is that we're having these conversations that are telling us that ESG is maybe not working the way we wanted it to, and we need to come up with better ways of measuring it, managing it, rather than taking it at face value. So I think that's good that the conversations are taking place.
Yep.
So I speak with CEOs all the time, and one of the most common questions I get is, Michael, tell me what are the things I need to be worrying about over the next 5 and 10 years. In your work with the HBR and generally with business leaders, what would you say are the big themes that you see shaping the world over the next few years?
I'm glad you didn't ask the next 100 years, because that would be folly. Well, so I think one is what we've just been talking about. I mean, the kind of the reinvention of capitalism. I mean, it's funny. I was just in Europe, and I was talking about this great debate between shareholder capitalism and stakeholder capitalism. It's so hard. And you talk to people from kind of Northern Europe,
Yeah.
from Norway, and they're like, "What? Why is this a problem?" They're so far ahead of us on this, and have come to a place where, they're quite happy with a newly aligned balance. It's just funny, and we're sort of struggling as if this is next to impossible, and it's
Yes.
harder given American history and American values. But anyway, so yeah, so the kind of emerging reinvention of capitalism, I think, is part of it. Um, the new collar idea, I mean, it's just interesting to see more and more companies are hiring in new ways, are abandoning this idea that you have to have whatever it is, a
Yeah.
college degree or whatever they thought was valuable in the past, and realizing how limiting that was in terms of looking for candidates, and how unnecessary it is in terms of looking for qualified candidates. So I think a continued reinvention of how we think about talent, and how we reskill talent ourselves within our companies, instead of relying on some institution to have done so before. Um, the kind of office versus remote versus hybrid, I don't think we figure that out yet.
Yeah.
I mean, here's an interesting point, I think. So a lot of us are comfortable working remotely, comfortable working hybrid. The data seem to show we're still productive, that we still seem to interact in a way that adds up to company culture, whatever. Um, but so Amy Edmondson, a brilliant professor at HBS, has a hunch. This is not based on research, but a
Yes.
hunch that part of that is, we have this reservoir of goodwill, or corporate glue or something like that, that got us through these past couple of years of remote work because we had a history of, kind of interaction,
Like a
physical
credit. We had a
interaction.
credit.
Yes, and that's dissipating, and that is gonna lose so that at a certain point, we're gonna use up that reservoir that's gotten us through, that's propelled us through these past few years, and that then it's gonna be a challenge to kind of recreate company culture without that. So I don't know if that's true, but I do think there's wisdom in just saying, if you're trying to figure out, how do you handle your workforce, don't just rely on the way things are right now. Just think a little bit more deeply about what you want and what you know about how organizations thrive. And we all have to come up with a reason for why people are in the office, other than, well, that's how we used to always do things. But um, I just think that just resonated with me when she said that we've gotten through the past couple years, but it may get harder, that we're losing some of that institutional glue, and may have to think about being together more, but with a purpose. Why are we doing it, and how do we take advantage of that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because from some of the data I've seen, it seems that employees and employers have managed the COVID distancing quite well, but we don't know what it will be like as we continue using up that credit. And we're in a sort of an experimental phase of seeing how we'll manage it. So that's a good point.
Yeah,
So I want to switch gears a little bit here, right?
sure.
So you've looked at many pieces of your time at the Harvard Business Review. We've spoken about timeless pieces like Michael Porter's and Jensen's piece and so on. What are some of the pieces that stood out for you personally, that had a personal impact on you, as opposed to just being influential for the broader audience?
Well, I guess what I want to be as a leader, let's say that. I mean, another enduring piece is Daniel Goleman's piece on what makes a leader. I mean, he was the guy who really, I don't think invented, but popularized the idea of EQ,
Hmm.
of sort of emotional intelligence as opposed to IQ, and that some of these softer skills really are as important as basic business
Yes.
knowledge, to being an effective leader. So I thought that was ahead of its time, and that's sort of all anybody talks about now. I mean, that's really the paradigm of leadership now. Um, I mean, one article that I always recommend, because it was influential to me, and it's a good starter article for people who don't
Yeah.
read HBR, is Clay Christensen's, not his piece, not his work on disruptive
Yeah.
innovation, but his piece, how will you measure your life?
I've actually read that
And
book. It's very good.
yeah, and that started as an HBR. Well, it started as his closing lecture to his students every year, and then we turned
Yes.
that into an HBR article, and then, yeah, as you say, it became a book. Um, but it really is, trying to apply discipline to the life you're living. You only have one, and sort of urging people to be as thoughtful about it as they are about sort of the projects that they undertake or the businesses that they run. And it just had some moving, simple truths. That it's easier to do the right thing 100% of the time than 98% of the time, because once you start making exceptions, it's over. So it just, it was a good inspiration. It's like in the early days of Google, when they had, "Don't be evil" everywhere, and,
Yeah.
you can talk about where that went, but it was a good reminder, yeah, don't be evil. And, it's a
Don't
good
be
reminder.
evil all of the time. I think that's the point.
I think, yeah, that's what, yeah, they didn't tell us about the bottom part. Um, and, beyond that, so one other thing, actually, back to this sort of shareholder value. I mean, an article that we published that really has meant a lot to me was a piece by Lynn Payne and Joe Bauer, which was it was the title was "The Error at the Heart of Corporate," I forget the last word, um, corporate strategy, maybe. But it pointed out why shareholder primacy was not what the law said, and didn't make sense in terms of practice. And it was ahead of its time, and it just sort of, because, again, as I was saying before, CEOs sort of felt like legally, or based on Delaware law, where
Yeah.
most of these companies are based, that they had to absolutely focus on shareholder return, or they were maybe breaking the law, or and they just pointed out from a kind of a legal and a practical value has that that's not what this is a trend, and it served us well in
The
some ways, but
fad.
it served us a fad. It served us well in some ways, served us poorly in some other ways, but there are other approaches, and so that was moving for me also.
So if it's not shareholder value creation, what would be the alternative approaches?
Well, that's the problem. That's where it becomes hard. So Doug McMillon, who's the CEO of Walmart
Yeah,
and a guy who thinks about these things a lot. I actually saw him yesterday at an event, and he was talking a little bit about this. And so for him, the broad stakeholders include his customers,
yeah.
his employees, the community, the environment, and so he just sort of has a sliding scale, and he knows he's going to over-index sometimes in terms of getting it right with his employees. If there's a sense that his employees are underpaid, he's going to devote a relatively large share of resources to them to make that right. And maybe another stakeholder will get a relatively small share, but hopefully over time you're taking care of all of them, not necessarily at the same moment in exactly the same way, but you're constantly looking and addressing where the problems are, and over time taking care of all of your stakeholders. So, that's great. That's a great approach. Again, it's not a theory of business. It's really a kind of approach that takes a lot of thinking and adapting, and the way one company does it will be different for another company. But again, it lacks the simplicity of shareholder value, but it's an interesting approach to try to make it right with this broad range of stakeholders. And I think he's somebody who believes if you don't get it right with all these people, eventually you won't succeed. That it's not altruism, it's not philanthropy, it's how to run a successful business for the long term.
Yeah, when speaking to executives, I almost get the sense that many of them see capitalism as driven by shareholder returns as the solution to a problem, when it may be better to think of it as an hypothesis that keeps on changing as we get more and more evidence. Is that a good way to think about it?
Well, so what's the problem? So what's the problem you imagine people would be solving
Oh,
in
I
their
don't know what it
shareholder
is,
return?
but
Yeah,
everyone, I think, has this view that unless they do this, they are going to be punished by the markets and their
right.
board of directors. And I
Yeah.
think that nobody's taking time to think about the problem because they think they have the solution.
Yeah, so I think boards are evolving. I mean, I think you put your finger on it when I mean, boards are in some ways more important than CEOs in terms
Mhm.
of setting direction for company and setting these expectations. And it is true. I mean, we could say, well, all right, share price doesn't matter. It does. And you will have activist investors who come after you, and it will be hard to keep your job if you don't succeed with the share value. That's just true. It's just I think we're learning it doesn't solve all the problems. I mean, the Milton Friedman wasn't, a horrible person when he said,
Yes.
that business should just focus on business. He just thought that's what business does. There are other ways to deal with social problems, and a successful business, by the way, will pay its staff well, and that will take care of some of these things. But this is not for business to worry about. And that people sort of like that idea for a while. We're just in a different place right now, and I think partly we've just seen that doesn't solve social problems to the extent that we're comfortable with. And I mean, this gets into the whole CEO activist
Oh, I
era
was
that we're
just
in
about to
now.
go there. That was going to be
Yeah.
my next question.
So I don't know if is CEO activism good or bad? Well, in some ways, it's like, okay, well, why are we asking CEOs to solve social problems?
Mhm.
So you could say that's not right. But, well, they are because we're feeling that government institutions have let us down, that there's a limit to what NGOs can do. You go to Davos and nothing happens, with sort of collaborations like that. Suddenly, employees are pressuring their companies to do more, to do better. Customers want to buy from companies that are not only share their values, but sort of step up at key moments. So, you can't sit on the sideline. I mean, that's CEOs have learned if they're silent, their silence will be interpreted for them on Twitter, and that so that they've got to step out and figure out. So that's a really tough thing. No CEO wants to get involved in social issues and
Yes.
political issues. That's not what they want to do, but they cannot avoid it now. And in my most idealistic sense, it's like, okay, so these ecosystems, these companies, if you have a CEO who says, "Look, I want to get it right in terms of diversity, and I want to get it right in terms of sustainability and, inclusion and other things." Okay, so maybe you've changed the world or improved the world one ecosystem at a time if governments aren't going to step up and do it, on a kind of broader basis.
Yeah, so it's an interesting discussion for me because in my previous life as a strategy partner, I used to work for resources companies. And it was very common for an oil and gas company, a gold miner, an aluminium smelter to move into a country and not just focus on extracting the ore and processing it and shipping it, but building the ecosystem around it, which is schools, hospitals, in some cases, universities. They had no problem getting involved in fixing the social gaps, for lack of a better word, that the government either was unwilling or could not fix themselves. So it's been happening in some sectors for a while, but I think it's just unusual in the United States for companies to take that role. And CEOs don't know how to have that conversation. They don't know how far they can go, how much shareholders will reward them for or punish them. There doesn't seem to be guidelines for CEOs in terms of how far to get involved. It's almost as if they get involved and they wait for the reaction from the press and the consumer, and then they recalibrate.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's an interesting example. I know there are companies that have said, we can't get involved in everything, and if we're upset, if Georgia introduces a law that seems to restrict voting, you know, and we make widgets, maybe we don't get involved in that one. I mean, as important as that will be to some people, we can't get involved in everything. If we're but maybe environmental things we do because that relates to our business. I mean, so there are some companies that have even come up with sort of formulas, and they sort of
Yes.
put in the data, and it kind of spits out, a kind of a ranking list. You can't get involved in everything, but these are pretty fundamental. They're consistent with who you are, that makes sense in terms of what your own, like, what problem you're creating. If you're generating a lot of carbon, okay, well, so you should be involved in that issue. But not necessarily every social thing that comes out. It's hard though, because your employees sometimes want to see you step up when there's
Yes.
some national tragedy or global tragedy, and they just want their leaders to step up and say what the employees need to hear. And it's a minefield. It's tricky just to sort of then try to do the right thing. You try to do the right thing, and then half the people applaud it, and half the people suddenly are protesting outside your doorstep. So it's a really complicated world, and in a world where we're connected, and where there are, places like Twitter, handling something incorrectly will cost you business and stock value overnight. So none of this can be ignored anymore. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's challenging.
I think it was Porter and Kramer. I'm not sure who was the second author who wrote a piece. I think it won the McKinsey Award, which talked about how companies can get involved in social issues if that social issue enabled their business to be more successful. And I can't remember when it was published. It was a couple of years ago. I thought that piece was it presented a very interesting framework for creating guidelines for how companies should get involved in social issues. But as
Yeah,
you said, it's very hard to know where the goalposts are.
yeah. So that was probably about 10 years ago. So they used the term shared value.
Yes.
And you're right, it was Porter and Mark Kramer, and yeah, I mean, they believed that there were sort of blue oceans that could be, no less profitable for companies than any other investment they might make, that would address these sort of social needs. And urged companies to look for these opportunities and create these ecosystems. And that's yes, they can point to examples. I mean, I'm not sure we've changed the world with that kind of thinking, but there are, there certainly have been some of those opportunities.
So in terms of the pieces that have come out from the HBR, have there been any that, and I'll pick my words carefully, haven't as aged as well?
Yes. I mean, look, we were among the many who wrote about Enron
Yes.
as
I didn't want
really
to bring
having.
it up, but I was going to go there.
No, no, that's fair. I was before my time, so it's easy for me to sort of be critical. But so yes, we were among those who thought Enron really had an approach to strategy that should be emulated. Um,
But before you move on from that, I want to unpack that a little bit.
sure.
And I know it's before your time, so you may not know the mechanics of what happened there, but how does an idea like that stand scrutiny for so long? How does it become accepted by so many smart, disciplined thinkers who have access to the books, who can see what is happening? How can Enron have been put on a pedestal for so long?
Well, I don't know about for so long. I mean, there was that initial heyday where
Yeah.
there was a lot of hype about the company and the people who researched the company thought this is the real deal and wrote about it, and it seemed to have the kind of rigor that we
Asset
require.
light
And
strategy. I remember that.
yeah, 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 and and it seemed way too complicated for most of us, but we were made to feel stupid for not getting the new paradigm. Um, so I think, look, I mean, it's hype. I mean, think of Theranos, think of
Yeah.
and maybe FTX. I mean,
Yes.
the people who in hindsight should have known better, who kind of fell for the hype, and we certainly fell for that one. I don't think we ever got GE right. I mean, I think we over admire. I mean, I think Jack Welch was a very complicated character, and in some ways had a lot of wisdom and a lot of soundbite wisdom that is
Yes.
valuable. Um, but I don't, we didn't understand sort of the extent to which he was gaming the system while he was CEO, and the extent to which he left a minefield for his successor. I'm not
Yes.
sure we got it right covering his successor either. So I don't think we've
Yeah.
ever gotten GE right. But in a more, I don't know, sustained way, you look back on what we wrote about gender, and it's absolutely cringeworthy that, I mean, in the 50s, we published a piece called, Successful Wives of
I
Successful
remember that.
Executives.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was really,
Well,
well,
it was cringeworthy, but appropriate for the time, right?
I guess. I mean, it might have even crossed some lines, but it was yeah, can I read a line from it?
Yes,
So
please, by all
so
means.
basically this thing said, "All right, it is the task of the wife to cooperate in working toward the goals set by her husband. This means accepting or perhaps encouraging the business trips, the long hours of the office, and the household moves dictated by his
Sounds
business
like an
career."
episode of Mad Men.
Totally, and then it gets worse, and it says, "As for the husband, quote, he may meet someone who conforms more closely to the new social standards he has acquired while moving socially upward. He may discard his wife either by taking a new wife or by concentrating all his attention on his
Wow.
business." Yeah. So, was that we might have even exceeded what was okay for the times in that piece. Again, 1956. So,
The good
yeah.
thing is that you're willing to go back and look at it and learn from it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, this stuff, it seems so foreign and distant.
Cringeworthy.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah. I
you
can't
know,
imagine that appearing anywhere in the press today.
we ran a piece about stock buybacks,
Yeah.
maybe, roughly 10 years ago, and um, I thought it was a great piece. In fact, it won the HBR McKinsey Award, that year. And it
Yeah.
was it was, everybody says, or it's commonly said that stock buybacks are bad for companies. They're not doing long-term investment, and et cetera, et cetera. So this was really based on research into that. Well, let's look at what the data really shows. But the author was a guy named William Lazonick.
Yeah.
So it was a piece that, like, our judges, and they're all sort of HBS professors and other professors and CEOs and things, thought it was a great piece and gave it the annual award for the best article in HBR. So I ran into Larry Summers shortly after that. I said, you have to write for us again. I said, did you see this piece by Bill Lazonic about stock buyback. He just said, yeah, it was execrable. He just thought it was
Yeah.
the worst thing he'd ever seen. So, I they're if you talk to some people, they would call that, a recklessly terrible piece that we published. Others thought it was worthy of an award. So sometimes, it really depends on who you're talking to in terms of whether a piece is cringeworthy or award worthy.
Yes. Well, Larry Summers is not known to keep his thoughts close to his chest. So,
Yeah,
uh,
that's the kindest thing that's ever been said about Larry Summers. Yeah.
but it's amazing. So, we've been talking about good ideas and bad ideas, but in my time, I've seen a good strategy often looks a lot like a bad strategy. I mean, in hindsight, you can say it's a bad strategy, but I've seen some pretty bad strategies get 100% vote of confidence from everyone. So, in hindsight, we know these things are bad, but how do we go about passing them in the moment?
So I don't know. I do not have a sort of easy answer
Yes.
to that at all, and I'm not sure our pages do. I mean, what we publish over and over again. I mean, I mean, to me, the most handy strategy framework is A.G. Lafley's, playing to
Yeah.
win framework that he used at Procter and Gamble, and Roger Martin was a co-author with
Yeah.
him and has done various things on that. And so it's just trying to be be disciplined about strategy, and these little simple things like strategy is about focus, strategy is about deciding what not to do. Those sound like little easy sound bites, but they're
Yes.
really hard to
Yeah.
implement.
Really hard.
Um, and I guess all I could say is, if you're willing to submit yourself to the discipline of strategy, in which you will say no to things that, by the way, the CEO proposed and everybody liked at one point. If you're willing to do that effort and use a framework like that, probably your chances of success are higher. Um, but I don't know. That uh, y there are amazing strategies where companies pivot, and in hindsight, you realize, "Wow, that was great." And then there are probably some where the pivot didn't work and you never heard about it again because it wasn't so great. So I don't know the science other than, you need discipline, you need a good framework.
Well, that's where strategy is social science, right? There's no objective measurements
Yeah.
except in hindsight. One of the things that I found very useful when reading, whether it's the HBR or even Financial Times, is that I don't look at what is presented to me as necessarily a solution or a prescription. And I hope the listeners can take this into consideration. I look at it as a series of questions that are being presented by the author or the journalist. And it's my job to use their thinking to answer the questions for myself. And I find that's a much better way of reading the HBR or the Financial Times or whatever it is. Because I don't think that anyone who's publishing in the HBR is telling you that this is the absolute answer. They're giving us their interpretation of the data they've seen.
Yeah, so that's a good way to put it. I think so you'll see pieces in HBR that maybe contradict one another.
Yes, I love those
Um
pieces.
well, or even that we publish something this year, and then 2
Yeah.
years later, we publish something that if you actually put them side by side, they're not the same. I mean, to me, I'm okay with that. To me, it's a little bit like, playing tennis or something. I mean, there is not one way to hit a backhand, but
Yeah.
as long as you are thinking hard about that and really focusing on that, then you can have success. You can take a couple different approaches. So I think part of this is, are you serious about this aspect of business and thinking about it? And I mean, now it's all about testing and data. And are you testing and getting data and then adapting? And so as long as you're focused, you can get to success, and you don't just have to go one route. So I think that's true. On the other hand, nobody reads just Harvard Business Review. I mean,
Yeah.
so we do feel pressure to actually be a little bit more assertive than you were saying. And not to say that this idea is the best idea and there'll never be a better idea, but to kind of give practical takeaways in the pieces we publish. And it's almost easy to make fun of HBR for, 3 ways to make your life
Yes.
better. But we get that signals that there's practical value in what we do, and we feel we need to do that because again, we're nobody's first read. So the people have to feel like, all right, I'm getting real, like, actionable insights from this. So that, so in some ways, we do say, try this, and we think this can help you.
Why did you say it's nobody's first read?
Oh, well, I just meant that we don't cover the world,
You're not a newspaper, like
yeah,
you're not
that's
the
really
Wall
what I
Street
meant.
Journal.
Yeah. So we're not comprehensive in that way, so we have to offer additional value in some other way.
Okay, that makes sense. So, Adi, I really enjoyed speaking to you. I mean, a wonderful conversation. Is there anything you want to add for our listeners before we wrap up?
No, I don't think there's anything to add. I mean, we love the fact that we still have an engaged reader base. 100 years after creation, we love the fact that we've outlived most of the companies that we write
Yes.
about. Um, as you mentioned before, I used to work for Time Magazine. It was much bigger circulation then, but without the kind of deep engagement that our readers and subscribers feel with the HBR brand. So that's just really heartening to feel like we're publishing something and people are the sort of lifelong learners who read HBR are moved by it and are using it to advance their careers and help their businesses. So that it's been a great run for us.
Well, I'll leave you with this, Adi, is that I've been reading Time and The Economist since I was maybe 13 years old. And I started reading HBR when I was about 21. But I've kept every copy of HBR and not of Time and The Economist. I think that's the difference between the publications.
Interesting. Do you ever pull out the old ones
I
and look
pull out
for?
the old ones because they are reference material to me.
Yeah. Now you realize that there's this digital thing and you can search.
Yes, I have that as well. Don't worry.
Okay.
I do search it.
Okay.
So don't worry. I have
Okay.
all, I just like making notes when I'm reading.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, I love that. You're not the only one. I mean, there are people who collect the old editions, and I love that. I love that people have that relationship with this brand.
Fantastic. Eddie, great to have you on the show. We hope to have you back again soon.
Yeah, thanks. Great to talk to you.
Take care. Ciao.